Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dad, and I'm the Sustainability Manager and originator of the Carbon Dance at Wilhelm. Today's session is titled How Carbon Credit Drive Market Demand in Global Market. Over the past few years, we have seen carbon credit move from being a niche sustainability tool to something that is increasingly shaped by standard policy signal and scrutiny around quality. In this session, I would like to share how definition of quality are evolving and why that evolution is now directly influencing market demand. Let me briefly walk you through the structure of today's section. First, I will start with the short introduction to Wilhelm so you have some context on where we sit in the carbon market. Then we will look at the problem the market has been facing, namely how quality concerns have undermined buyers' confidence in recent years. In the third part, we will move into the new rules of the game, how policy development, standard, and rating frameworks are reshaping expectation around carbon credit quality. Finally, I will close by sharing how Wilhelm apply this landscape in practice and how we support clients in sourcing carbon credit that are fit for purpose, compliant, and future-proof. With that, let me start by briefly introduce Wilhelm. Wilhelm is a private-hold international commodity trading company with over 30 years of experience in global market. We are headquartered in Taipei, and our core business span carbon credit, energy, steel, and agricultural products. In the carbon market, we are approved seller member on Climate Impact X and the Taiwan Carbon Solution Exchange and Hong Kong exchanges. Today, we work with over 100 Tier 1 and Tier 2 VCM suppliers globally, which allow us to source and structure carbon credit across different project type, region, and quality requirements. Wilhelm started as an energy and steel commodity trading company, but as our clients moved into their low carbon transition journey, their needs began to change. In response, we built out a low carbon business strategy that connects carbon credit, biofuel, biomass, and sustainable agriculture, all anchored around decarbonization and energy transformation. I want to start by addressing a key issue that has reshaped the voluntary carbon market over the past 2 to 3 years, a credibility crisis. A number of high-profile cases has raised serious questions about how carbon credits are generated, verified, and managed. As a result, buyer confidence has declined, and the market has become much more cautious. Let me briefly walk you through 4 examples that help explain how this issue emerged. A serious investigation from 2023 media report to scientific review in 2025 uncovered widespread overcrediting in REDD+ forest conservation project. Key findings include only 19% of evaluated REDD+ project delivered climate impact that claimed. Roughly 90% of Verra certified REDD+ credit were found to lack real climate benefit. This became known as phantom credit. The problem stemmed from inaccurate baseline, weak additionalities, and leakage effect. Performance is also a major concern. Forests protected today may be destroyed later. This case fundamentally shock trust in nature-based credit, especially large-scale avoided deforestation methodology. In August 2024, Vera rejects 37 rice cultivation projects and revoked around 1.8 million carbon credits. There were several reasons behind this decision. First, some of the projects never actually exist or were never implemented on the ground. Second, around 40% of the farmers were already using the same practice before the project started, which meant there were little or no additionalities. On top of that, baseline emissions were seriously underestimated. And in many cases, validation firms failed to catch even basic methodological issues. This case highlights a broader challenge. Agriculture carbon projects can be especially vulnerable to data gap and misreporting. When projects involve large number of small, dispersed farms, it becomes much harder to verify what is really happening on the ground. Next, in 2024, Sequest, a major coastal project developer, became involved in a serious case of data fraud. Investigation found that usage data had been heavily overstated. In reality, many households barely use the cool stove and some never use them at all. As a result, the project ended up issuing far too many carbon credits. By March 2025, ICVCM excluded most cool stove credit from eligibility. Not long after that, Sequest filed for bankruptcy, and a lawsuit of over 170 million USD is still ongoing. Cool stoves were once seen as a high-volume, low-cost type of credit. This case completely changed how the market viewed that category. In December 2025, Vera raised concern about the authenticity of the documents submitted for several offload projects in China. The issues were not just technical. They included questionable governance approval and registration documents, as well as broader compliance and integrity gaps. In addition, the local regulatory environment made independent verification extremely difficult. Together, this exposed wider systematic risk in cross-border project oversight. This case made one thing clear: beyond methodology risk, governance and document integrity has become critical factor in how carbon credit quality is assessed. Taken together, these four cases fundamentally change how the market thinks about carbon credit. Trust alone was no longer enough. Today, quality, not volume, has become the key factor shaping carbon market. Once trust was broken, the market had to respond. The response came in the form of clear rules, stronger standards, and greater reliance on independent assessment. This brings us to the next part of today's section. Before we dive in individual frameworks like ICVCM, VCMI, ISO, or SBTI, it helps to step back and ask a more basic question: who actually set carbon credit quality? The short answer is there is no single authority. Instead, quality is shaped by several different players, each focusing on a different part of decision process. Let's start with registry. Registry was the minimum threshold for credit to exist. Through approval methodology and issuance rules, they decide whether a project is eligible to generate carbon credit at all. What registries are not doing is ranking quality. They are answering a simple question: can this be recognized as a carbon credit in the first place? Next are the supply side standards, such as ICVCM. These do not issue credit either. Instead, that define what the market considers high integrity supply. They help signal which type of credit are more likely to remain acceptable over time as expectation and scrutiny increase. Then we have demand side standard, including frameworks like VCMI, ISO 14068, and SBTI. These focus on different questions, not whether a credit exists, but whether and how it can be used. Here, quality is closely linked to the credibility, claims, and risks at the point of use. The same credit may be acceptable in one context, but not in another. Finally, we have rating agency. Rating agency act as a risk translation layer. They analyze projects using their own model and turn complex integrity risks into a comparable signals. They don't set hard rules, but they help buyers, government, and intermediary you understand difference between credit that might otherwise look similar. So when we talk about carbon credit quality, we are not talking about a single checklist or a single judge. Quality is shaped by how all of these layers interact, from whether a credit can exist to whether it is considered high integrity supply, to whether it can be credibly used and how the risk can understand. With that context in mind, let's now look more closely at how each of these frameworks define quality in practice. Now that we have talked about who set carbon credit quality, the next question is, what do they actually require from carbon credit? On this slide, I have put 4 key frameworks side by side: ICVCM, VCMI, ISO 14068, and SBTI, ongoing emission responsibility. They all talk about quality, but they are asking different questions at different points in the decision process. In the next few slides, I will walk through them one by one, starting from the supply side and then moving downstream to use, claim, and long-term responsibility. Let's start with ICVCM. ICVCM is an independent governance body that focuses on supply side, integrity in the voluntary carbon market. Its main contribution is the Coal Carbon Principle, or CCP. There are 10 principles that describe what high integrity carbon credit supply should look like. It's important to be clear about what CCP does and what it does not do. CCP is a signal of supply quality, not a permit for use. It helps the market identify what we might call good supply, but it does not decide how or where a credit can be used. Aligning with CCP can significantly reduce integrity risk. However, it does not remove all use case restriction. Whether a credit can actually be used still depends on demand side standard, regulation, or corporate claim. In short, ICVCM defines good supplies, not good use. The second framework is VCMI. VCMI stands for Voluntary Carbon Market Integrity Initiative. It does not asset project, but it does not asset or approve carbon credit. Instead, VCMI focuses on how companies use carbon credit and how they talk about that use. So it's less about judging the credit itself and more about protecting credibility at the point of use. VCMI is very clear on one thing. Carbon credit should represent emission reduction or removal outside a company's own value chain. In other words, credits are meant to support real decarbonization, not replace it. When it comes to quality, VCMI prioritizes credits that are aligned with ICVCM CCP or issued under Article 6.4. At the same time, it allows some transition flexibility where supply is still limited, as long as company applies strong due diligence and are transparent about it. The key takeaway is that under VCMI, quality is not just about what they buy. Transparency, ambition, and how credit are used are all part of what define quality. Next, ISO 14068 focus on one key question. Is the carbon neutralization claim credible and verifiable? From a carbon credit perspective, the standard sets some clear boundary. Credit must come from projects that are additional, measurable, permanent, and verifiable. And they must be either reduction or removal project. There are also clear rules on timing. Credit must be issued within a 5-year vintage window, and they need to be retired within 12 months after the reporting period. It's also important to note that ISO 14068 itself does not rank methodology or require specific labels such as CCP. The standard focuses on principle rather than naming or endorsing specific program. However, in real-world verification, assurance bodies often apply additional check to manage their own risk. For example, in recent ISO 14068 verification carried out by BSI Taiwan, companies were asked to avoid methodology that has been negatively flagged by ICVCM and were encouraged to use CCP label project where possible. This highlights an important point. Under ISO 14068, carbon credit quality is shared not only by the standard itself, but also by how auditors assess risk and credibility in practice. The next one is SBTi ongoing emission responsibility. Before going deeper, I want to clarify one key point about SBTi latest draft. SBTi is not changing how net zero targets are achieved. Carbon credits still do not count toward target progress. What's new is the ongoing emission responsibility, or OER. Is formally recognized voluntary carbon credit use outside target achievement, while clearly pointing toward a long-term shift to carbon removals. I will unpack how this works in more detail on the next slide. This slide brings together the key element of SBTi ongoing emission responsibility framework in one place. So let me walk you through how to read it. SBTi differentiate company into two segments, category A and category B. The main distinction is company size and whether they are based in high income or low and middle income country. Before 2035, OER is optional for both categories. During this phase, company can use both reduction and removal credit, provided they meet basic integrity requirements such as additionality, safeguard against reversal, and transparency. And the mitigation outcomes are generated from 2021 onward. The key shift happened after 2035, especially for category A company. At that point, ongoing emission responsibility become mandatory and credit use is limited to removal only. Importantly, SBTi also signal a clear direction on quality. Over time, a larger share of credit is expected to come from long life removal, with any remaining portion made by short or long life removal. For category B companies, the structure is aligned, but the application remains optional. In other words, the integrity expectations are the same, but the label of compulsion is different. On top of this, SBTi introduced two recognition labels. The recognized label set a low entry bar, addressing at least 1% of ongoing emission either through mitigation outcome or internal carbon prices. The leadership label goes much further, combine a high internal carbon price with a requirement to address at least 40% of emission through mitigation outcomes. The key takeaway from this slide is that SBTi ongoing emission responsibility is not just about whether carbon credits are allowed, it is about when they are allowed, what type of credit are expected, and how expectation tighten over time, especially for large companies in high-income countries. So why does ongoing emission responsibility matter from a market perspective? Even at a very conservation level, just 1% adoption by SBTi aligned company, ongoing emission responsibility could drive annual demand of over 100 million carbon credits. More importantly, this demand is not tied to target compliance. It comes from ongoing emission responsibility, which creates steady, repeat demand and send long-term capital into both carbon reduction and carbon removal projects. And this is before we factor a higher ambition level or the post-2035 shift toward removals. Now, let's move from the voluntary carbon credit market to one of the most important compliance-based systems globally, CORSIA. CORSIA stands for Carbon Offsetting and Reduction Scheme for International Aviation, and it is a mandatory program under ICAO. Starting from 2024, international flights between participating countries are required to monitor and report their emissions, and when required, offsetting emissions above the 2019 baseline. This can be done through CORSIA eligible credit or the use of sustainability aviation fuel. CORSIA is rolled out in phases. There was a pilot phase from 2021 to 2023. We are now in phase 1 from 2024 to 2026, which is voluntary but comes with very strict eligibility rules. From 2027 onward, phase 2 becomes mandatory for most countries. The key takeaway is simple. CORSIA is no longer optional. Airlines must comply, and this compliance requirement is already driving real demand for high-quality carbon credit. When we talk about CORSIA, one thing is very clear. Not every carbon credit can be used. To qualify as a CORSIA eligible emission unit or EEU, the requirement are extremely strict. First, credit must come from ICAO approved standards such as VERA, Gold Standard, ACR, ART, isometric, and such like that. But being under an approved standard is only the starting point. Project must clearly show strong additionality. Airline cannot use credit for emission reduction that would have happened anyway. There are also tight vintage rules. Activity must start after 2016, and the emission reduction must be generated from 2021 onward. In phase 1, several project types are excluded, including most RED+ and conventional renewable energy projects. And finally, for credit issued after 2021, Article C authorization is required to avoid double counting under the Paris Agreement. All of these filters significantly reduce the number of the credit that can qualify, which is why CORSIA demand is rising much faster than available supply. Now let's look at demand, and this is where the scale really becomes clear. In 2024, global aviation emission reached about 597 million tons CO2. Out of that, around 363 million tons were covered by CORSIA. Based on the 2019 baseline, airline needed to offset roughly 58 million tons of CO2 in 2024 alone. And this is just the beginning. During phase 1, total demand is expected to reach between 146 and 237 million tons. In phase 2, the number grows much larger. Cumulative demand is estimated at between 500 million tons and 1.3 billion tons, with annual demand increasing toward the later years. So there are two key takeaways. First, Corsia is already a significant source of demand in the carbon market. Second, as aviation country to recover, that demand is only going to increase. So what happens when demand grows very quickly but supply stays extremely limited? The answer is simple. We get a supply shortage and the price move up fast. In phase one, total eligible supply is estimated at only about 16 to 18 million tons. That's against demand of roughly 146 to 237 million tons. Put differently, nearly 90% of the demand simply doesn't have supply to match it. One major reason is the bottleneck around Article 6 data of authorization. As of early 2026, only around 50 projects worldwide has received an LOA. Together, they provide roughly 16 million tons, and most of that supply comes from single project in Guyana. With supplies this tight, prices have moved to the very difficult level. Corsia eligible credits are already trading at several times the price of typical voluntary market credit, roughly in the range of $18 to over $90 per ton. And with phase one compliance deadline coming up in early 2028, airlines are not waiting. Many are moving early to secure supply now before price move even higher. So far, we have talked about Corsia, where eligibility is clearly defined and strictly enforced. But outside of formal compliance system, buyers still face a key question. How do we judge quality and risk when credits are technically eligible but not all equal? This is where rating agency comes in. Today, buyers are no longer satisfied with registry approval alone. They want an independent view on risk, quality, and credibility. On this slide, we highlight three of the most widely used rating agencies in the market. B0 provides project rating from AAA to D, covering over 600 projects worldwide. Severa uses a similar AAA to D scale, but at a larger coverage with more than 3,000 projects globally. Helix Global takes a slightly different approach, combining GHG integrity rating with SDG impact scores, and offering analysis at a vintage level. Importantly, these agencies are not certifying or approving credit. Their role is to translate risk, helping buyers see difference that are not obvious from registry document alone, such as baseline credibility, permanent risk, or data uncertainty. As the market becomes more cautious, the influence of rating agencies keeps growing. Many corporate buyers now include minimum rating requirements as part of their carbon credit procurement policy. This slide draws on Severa's State of Carbon Credit 2025 report, which gives us a clear picture of how buyer behavior is changing. In 2024, total credit retirement actually fell by about 4.5%, down to 168 million credit. But interestingly, the total market value is still growing by 6%. The reason is simple. Buyers are paying more for better quality. Credit rated BB plus or above, accounting for about half of all retirement, but nearly 70% of total spending. That tells us buyers are prioritizing integrity over volume. We also see a shift in the type of project being used. On the nature-based project, demand is moving away from RED Plus toward IFM, ARR, and agriculture-related projects. On the technology project, buyers are moving away from traditional renewable and toward waste, industrial, and commercial abatement. Looking forward, the forward market has grown rapidly, reaching over $12 billion in pre-purchase contracts. This shows strong confidence in future demand. Several also expect the compliance-driven retirement to overtake voluntary retirement by 2027, as Article 6 mechanism and government-to-government agreements start to scale. So the key takeaway is clear. The market is shifting decisively toward high-integrity credit, and the supply is not keeping up, which reinforces the premium pricing trend we discussed earlier. We have covered a lot today: registry, supply side standard, demand side standard, and how expectations around carbon credit quality are evolving. What this all points to one simple reality: carbon credit quality is no longer a checklist. It is a moving target. Standards evolve, use cases differ, and what is acceptable today may not be acceptable tomorrow. This is where Weihang supports our clients. On the advisory side, we help clients map their requirements, whether it is ISO 14068, SBTi ongoing emission, or claim framework like BCMI, and translate those requirements into practical, defensible sourcing strategy. We also support engagement with verification body and internal trading, so teams understand not just what to buy, but why. On procurement, we focus on early risk management, project screening, and execution, including multiple currency transactions to ensure credit meets both current and future expectations. And after the trade, we continue to support clients through custody, retirement, transfer, and portfolio management, helping ensure credit are used and disclosed in a way that remain credible over time. In short, our role is to help clients stay ahead of a moving target and turn evolving carbon credit standard into actionable compliance solution. That's all today.